George Russell just did something in China that almost never happens in modern Formula One. He set a lap so fast that the reigning world champion finished more than 1.5 seconds behind. In a sport usually decided by thousandths of a second, that kind of gap is shocking. But the real story started the moment Max Verstappen stepped out of the car. Because instead of just blaming Red Bull's struggles, Verstappen hinted at something very unusual about the Mercedes. Something about how the W17 delivers its power. Something that engineers across the paddock immediately started talking about. Because the numbers from the Chinese sprint qualifying are brutal. Russell on pole with a 1 minute 31.520 lap. Antonelli right behind him. A perfect Mercedes front row lockout. Meanwhile the reigning champion, the driver who dominated the previous era of Formula One, could only qualify 8th. And when a gap like that appears at the start of a brand new regulation era, the entire paddock starts asking the same question. Did Mercedes simply build the fastest car? Or did Verstappen just reveal something about the W17 that the rest of the grid has not figured out yet? Because once you understand what Max hinted at after that lap in Shanghai, the story of the Chinese Grand Prix suddenly becomes far bigger than just one qualifying session. To understand why Verstappen's comments caused so much attention in the paddock, we need to go back a few hours. Because the story of this Chinese Grand Prix weekend did not begin with the final lap of sprint qualifying. It actually started during the only practice session teams had on Friday. This is a sprint weekend, which means the entire grid had just 1 hour of running before qualifying. 1 hour to understand the circuit, 1 hour to dial in the setup, and 1 hour to make sure the new 2026 cars behaved correctly on one of the most technical tracks in the championship. For many teams, that limited time created chaos. Engineers rushed through setup changes. Drivers complained about balance. And several cars struggled to find grip as the track evolved. But one team looked completely different from the very first laps. Mercedes. George Russell went straight to the top of the timing screens. Lap after lap, the Mercedes looked stable through the long corners of Shanghai. The car remained calm under heavy braking. And when Russell accelerated onto the massive back straight, the car simply kept gaining speed. Right behind him was his teammate, Kimi Antonelli. Another Mercedes. Another fast lap. By the end of that session, the message was already clear. Mercedes had finished first and second in the only practice session of the entire weekend. And that result immediately caught the attention of the paddock. Because Shanghai is not an easy circuit to master instantly. The layout exposes every weakness in a Formula One car. Long sweeping corners require aerodynamic stability. Heavy braking zones punish poor balance. And the long straight demands perfect hybrid energy deployment. If any part of the car is not working correctly, this circuit reveals it immediately. Yet the Mercedes looked comfortable everywhere. In the fast corners. In the braking zones. And especially on the straights. That last detail is extremely important under the new 2026 regulations. These cars depend heavily on electrical deployment from the hybrid system. Drivers recover energy under braking. Store it inside the battery. Then release it on the straights to boost acceleration. If that system runs out of energy too early, the car suddenly loses speed halfway down the straight. Drivers call this clipping. And several teams have already struggled with that issue during the first races of the season. But during practice in China, the Mercedes did not show any sign of that problem. The car accelerated smoothly. Consistently. Almost effortlessly. And that detail is exactly what Max Verstappen later began talking about after sprint qualifying. Because while Mercedes looked calm and confident from the first lap, Red Bull was dealing with the exact opposite situation. Max Verstappen finished that same practice session only 8th. Almost 2 seconds slower than Russell's benchmark lap. For a team that dominated the previous era of Formula One, that gap was alarming. And it immediately suggested that Red Bull was still searching for the correct balance with the RB22. Which brings us to the moment when the real performance differences could no longer hide. Sprint qualifying. The session where every team must finally reveal what their car can really do over one single lap. Sprint qualifying was supposed to answer one simple question. Was Mercedes fast in practice? Or were they about to dominate the entire weekend? And within minutes, the answer became obvious. From the first phase of qualifying, George Russell looked completely in control. Every lap he completed was fast enough to stay near the top of the timing sheets. Not by a tiny margin. By a comfortable margin. The Mercedes looked balanced through the long opening corner of Shanghai. Stable under braking into the tight hairpins. And extremely efficient when accelerating onto the massive back straight. Which is exactly where the biggest difference between teams began to appear. Because while the Mercedes kept accelerating smoothly, some other cars started losing speed halfway down the straight. That is the classic sign of clipping. The moment when the hybrid system runs out of electrical deployment. The boost disappears, and the car stops gaining speed. But the Mercedes did not show any sign of that problem. The acceleration looked clean and continuous all the way to the braking zone. And that detail became even more obvious as the session continued. Russell stayed near the top in every phase of qualifying. Each time the track improved, he improved with it. Each time rivals pushed harder, he still had another tenth available. Meanwhile, in the Red Bull garage, the atmosphere was very different. Max Verstappen was not fighting for pole position. He was fighting simply to stay inside the safe zone. Every lap looked difficult. The RB22 moved around through the corners. Small corrections on the steering wheel. Tiny slides that cost crucial time. And when the first qualifying segment ended, something shocking appeared on the timing screen. Verstappen had barely survived elimination. For a driver who dominated entire seasons not long ago, that situation was almost unthinkable. But the bigger surprise was still coming. Because when the session reached the final phase, Q3, Russell delivered the lap that changed the entire conversation inside the paddock. 1 minute 31 seconds and 520 milliseconds. A lap that immediately locked him into sprint pole position. And when the rest of the grid crossed the line, the gap became impossible to ignore. No one was close. Not McLaren. Not Ferrari. And certainly not Red Bull. Even more impressive, Russell's teammate Kimi Antonelli finished only a few tenths behind. Another Mercedes on the front row. Another 1-2 result for the team. But then everyone looked further down the timing sheet. Because that is where the real shock appeared. Max Verstappen had finished 8th. More than 1.5 seconds slower than Russell's pole lap. For a reigning champion, that gap is extraordinary. And when Verstappen climbed out of the car, his reaction made the situation even more dramatic. He did not hide his frustration. He called the entire day a disaster. He said the car had zero grip, zero balance, and that they were losing massive amounts of time through the corners. Those are strong words from a driver who usually adapts to almost any situation. But hidden inside those comments was something even more interesting. Because when Verstappen began comparing the Red Bull to the Mercedes, he mentioned one specific detail. The way the Mercedes delivers its power. Not just the speed. The consistency of that speed down the straight. And that observation may explain why Russell's lap in Shanghai looked almost untouchable. Because under these new regulations, the real performance advantage is not just raw horsepower. It is how efficiently a team manages the hybrid energy system. How smoothly the energy is deployed. And how long that electrical boost can be maintained during acceleration. And right now, based on what we saw in sprint qualifying, the MERCEDES W17 might be doing that better than anyone else on the grid. Which raises a very uncomfortable question inside the paddock. Is the Mercedes simply the fastest car of the new era? Or has the team discovered something about energy deployment that the rest of Formula One has not understood yet? Because if Verstappen's observation is correct, then Russell's incredible lap in China may only be the beginning of a much bigger story. And this is where the story becomes even more interesting. Because when a driver like Max Verstappen starts pointing out details about a rival car, the entire paddock pays attention. Not because drivers are engineers. But because drivers feel things inside the cockpit that numbers sometimes hide. They feel when another car keeps accelerating longer on the straight. They hear when the engine tone changes during energy deployment. They notice when their own boost disappears, while the car in front continues pulling away. And that is exactly the kind of detail Verstappen hinted at after sprint qualifying in China. Because when journalists asked him about the massive gap to the Mercedes, he did not simply talk about Red Bull's problems. Instead, he pointed toward how the Mercedes behaves on the straights. How smoothly the car delivers its energy. How consistently it accelerates out of corners. And those comments immediately triggered a wave of discussions inside the paddock. Because under the 2026 regulations, hybrid energy management has become the most important performance factor in Formula One. These cars rely heavily on electrical power. Drivers recover energy under braking. Store it in the battery. Then deploy it on the straights to maximize acceleration. If the system is not perfectly optimized, the electrical boost runs out too early. The car suddenly stops accelerating. And rivals gain speed rapidly. But the Mercedes did not appear to suffer from that weakness at all in Shanghai. Russell's lap showed something very different. The car accelerated smoothly from the exit of the corner. All the way to the braking zone at the end of the straight. No sudden drop in speed. No visible clipping. Just continuous acceleration. That level of efficiency usually means one thing. The integration between the power unit, the battery system, and the aerodynamic platform is extremely refined. And according to several analysts inside the paddock, Mercedes may currently be the team that has understood this new regulation package the best. Their car looks balanced in every phase of the lap. Strong through the corners. Stable under braking. And incredibly efficient when deploying energy on the straights. That combination is extremely powerful in modern Formula One. Because when the driver trusts the car, every lap becomes easier to execute. Braking points become more precise. Corner exits become cleaner. And qualifying laps start to look almost effortless. Which is exactly what Russell demonstrated in Shanghai. Meanwhile, Red Bull appears to be facing the opposite situation. Verstappen admitted that the RB22 currently lacks grip, lacks balance, and that the team is losing massive amounts of time through the corners. For the first time in several seasons, Red Bull is not controlling the pace of the championship. Instead, they are searching for answers, analyzing data, trying to understand why the car is struggling to find performance under the new rules. And that contrast between the two teams could define the early phase of the 2026 season. On one side, Mercedes looks calm, confident, and perfectly prepared for the new era. On the other side, Red Bull appears to be in a period of discovery. Trying to understand a car that does not yet behave the way they expected. But the real test is still coming. Because sprint qualifying only shows what a car can do over one perfect lap. The sprint race will reveal something much more important. How the Mercedes behaves in traffic. How its hybrid system performs over multiple laps. And whether the W17 can maintain this incredible pace when the cars are fighting wheel to wheel. Because if the Mercedes can do that as well, then Russell's pole lap in China may not just be a qualifying highlight. It may be the moment the entire Formula One grid realized that Mercedes has arrived at the front of the new era.